Okay, thank you. As I said, I'm Rachel Morley. I'm the director of the Friends of Friendless Churches, and I'm really happy to be here with Andrew Faulkner, who is the church architect for St. James's, Llangua, which is what we're talking about this evening. The way that it's going to work is I am going to do kind of a quick introduction to the Friends. I know most of you know who we are already, so I'll just tell you a little bit about us. And then we've really been on a long road with this church. Probably, golly, Andrew first got involved probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and we've only just got to site. So it's been a long road. I'll tell you a little bit about that road, but this evening is about the future. So I will then hand over to Andrew, who will talk you through the repairs, what's happening there. Andrew's got some great slides. And then he'll pass back to me, and I will have to do, I'm really sorry, my obligatory FOFC sales pitch. But I won't, it won't be too long or too painful, I promise. Right, let's get going. So who are the Friends of Friendless Churches? Well, I guess we're sort of this strange group of people who go around England and Wales looking for difficult, expensive, sad churches that need saving. Yeah, we've been doing it for 67 years, so we've got into a bit of habit of this. But yes, so we rescue and repair these churches. We have 64 churches in our care at the moment. It's roughly even between England and Wales, kind of, so whatever, 32 in each country. So yes, we have about an even number of churches in each country, and so we repair them and we keep them open. Most of our churches are open every single day, so you can go in just to visit them, enjoy them, have a bit of private prayer. They can be used for community use, kind of concerts, exhibitions. We have a stained glass artist in one church. We have a pipe organ repair workshop going into another church. So lots of things happen in our churches. So some of them have been cycling along while I've been talking, but really, I guess we're so lucky, and it's such a privilege to do this job, because some of the most important cultural treasures are in our care, and we get to look after them, and I'm really, really pleased about that. But to begin, so our story really begins on a roadside in Monmouthshire, and it starts right here at St. James's. This church is so important in the history of the Friends, because it was in the early 1950s that a man in his 30s, Ivor Bulmer-Thomas, passed this church. And when he passed it, it was derelict, kind of, semi-ruinous. And he, despite kind of the rubbish and the droppings and the dereliction, he obviously felt that it was a place that still felt numinous and still had a potency. And he was a man who, he had suffered a really kind of devastating loss earlier in his life. Ivor's young wife, Dilys, died at the age of 28, and he never really got over it for his whole life. When he was in his 50s and 60s, he wrote a threnody in her memory. He did go on to marry somebody else and have various children with her, but he never really forgot Dilys. And he restored this church in her memory. So these are some of the repairs that went on. So you can see there's the medieval timber roof, and they're adding some more bits to it. And you've got the stone roof going on there. I'm not entirely sure who this chap is. I wish I did. But we are very lucky to have some photos of those 1950s repairs going on. So Ivor repaired the church in Dilys's memory. And the minute you open the door, the first thing that you see in the church is this monument that he had commissioned for her. So it's black and gold leaf and kind of a Latin inscription. And so yes, the minute you open the door, that is what you see. So that is what he wanted you to see the minute you opened that door. So yes, this is St. James's kind of as it is. We got here, golly, in 2019, we were contacted by Hereford Diocese, and they said that the church I think it was down to about 2 members of the PCC, and it's right in, you saw at the start, it's right in that bend in the river, so it floods a lot. And basically, they just felt that there wasn't a need pastorally for the church anymore. So the diocese contacted us, and we called in Andrew. And Andrew did a condition survey, and unfortunately, it wasn't kind of, oh, golly, what am I doing here? That is not what I wanted to happen. Unfortunately, it wasn't in the best condition. I will come back to the condition in a second. My slides are a little bit out of order, so I'm sorry. So just to go back and say about the founding of the Friends of Friendless Churches. So Ivor repaired St. James's in memory of Dillis, and that was in 1954, 1955. And then I guess he started going around the country and started seeing the plight of lots of other churches, such as these fellows. And golly, in this, they were in, churches that had been left to decay for, decades, and they were in really dire condition. And so Ivor decided that something had to be done about it. So 3 years later, in 1957, he got together a group of his friends. That's Ivor there outside our church at Llangua on Anglesey. But Ivor got together some of his, some of his friends really, but luckily for him, his friends included people like John Betjeman, John Piper, Roy Jenkins, kind of all the people that you'd really want to have on speed dial. So he called all those people up, and they had a meeting in the House of Commons, and they just decided that something really had to be done, because even though churches weren't, some of these churches were no longer needed for kind of mission and faith purposes, they still had an architectural value, they had a cultural value, but also for Ivor, he felt that a church in itself is an act of worship. So just the building of a church is an act of worship, and it doesn't matter kind of who's using it, or if nobody's using it, that building bears witness in the landscape. And certainly some of these ones that we've taken on, are kind of 800, 900 years old. So they've been around for a really long time. So in 1957, they all got together, this group of people, and they emerged from the House of Commons with a name, and that name was the Friends of Friendless Churches. So some of the earliest cases that we've took on were just like this fellow, Tuxless Chapel in Milan, just looks awful. And we got to work on it, and this is Tuxless now. So it's in really good repair. It's a beautiful church in this wooded setting. The church, the chapel, you can't see, just beyond this tree here is an enormous big-boned Victorian church that replaced, so the chapel was small enough, or was big enough rather, to suit the congregation's needs until about, say, the 1890s. And then this big church was built right on its doorstep because there was a lot more people. The chapel spent a while as a Sunday school, fell into dereliction and was really close to being pulled down. But this is it now. It's open every day. It has a friends group, and it is really beautiful. And as you can see from the signs here, it's on a walking trail, so we get lots of people calling in every day, which is great. So people say, well, that was the 1970s. That was the Wild West of church dereliction or whatever. And churches don't look like that now. That's not the case. This is a church we took on in 2018, St. Dennis's, East Hatley. The church closed in the 1960s. The glass was stripped out, the floorboards were pulled out. It was called cheap and nasty, and even though it was built in about 1217. So it was cheap and nasty, and nobody wanted it anymore. Fine. This is what the church looked like. The local authority stripped off all the ivy, and then very kindly asked us would we like to take it on. This is before I joined the Friends, and bizarrely my trustees said we'd love to, but this is what it looks like now. So that's St. Dennis's now. New floorboards, new roofs, new windows, walls replastered. We still have to put in an east window where we want to put in a beautiful stained glass window, but it's a big responsibility to decide what sort of stained glass to put in a church. Sorry, am I standing in front of you? you sure? Sorry. Great. So that's St. Denis's Athley now. But there really are still churches like this. This is a project we've got on site at the moment. Some of you have been to the talk at St. James about Gumfreston. But this is St. Lawrence's before we got going. So the ivy was really starting to take over. And yes, we are on site there at the moment. And it's very wet on that day, obviously. But the repairs are going really, really well. Andrew's the architect for that one as well. But yes, it wasn't just in the 70s that churches looked in dreadful condition. So back to St. James's. That was in dreadful condition too. So we were approached about it in 2019. Andrew did a condition survey, and we had thought it would be a really straightforward thing. You know, yes, this church has really important connections to our founder. You know, off the back of that church, he went on to found an organisation, the first organisation about conserving redundant churches, preserving redundant churches. So ultimately, he changed the fate of churches in England and Wales through this church. But Andrew did his report, and it wasn't great news, really, I have to say. Obviously, lots of nice structural cracks, huge problems with the roof, which Andrew will go into in much more detail than I am. I'm just going to show you some scary photos. So yes, for me, the main thing was when Andrew rang and said the wall plate on the north side has moved out so much that there's only about 20 millimeters of bearing. So I think we should get somebody in to prop it pretty soon. So we did. So we were a bit worried about that. It took a long while to get things going for various reasons. That's some of the propping that we installed. It took a long while to get things going for various reasons. Golly, I mean, I don't want to, but issues with the local authority, one thing, but also funding. It was going to be a really expensive project, and how were we going to manage it? About the Friends, we're a small organisation. There's 3 of us, 3 staff. We have lots of volunteers, including the lovely Susan Dalton, who's been with us for over 25 years as a volunteer, and she's at the back in green. So there's only 3 of us, and we don't receive any funding in England, and we receive about £160,000, 80 from the Church in Wales, 80 from CADU for repairing and taking on more churches in Wales. But this one was much more expensive than that. So we had to try and find funding from elsewhere. So after various years of trying to find funding, we went to the National Heritage Memorial Fund, who are self-styled the funder of last resort. So last year, I wrote an application. It was a two-part application. So it was for a grant for St. Lawrence's in Gumfreston and a grant for St. James's. And they liked the application, thank God. And they awarded us a grant for 74% of the costs towards the repair. So that was actually on the 17th of May, 2023. So almost a year to the day that we got the news. So I rang Andrew and told him to get going. And yes, then Andrew kicked into action.
Lovely. Hi, everyone. Well, I've had the pleasure of going to this church today and seeing Jones and Fraser making a start. Tom Jones is in the back here, and they're going at it very quickly and very, very carefully and thoughtfully, and it's really exciting to see something happening already. They're just getting the scaffolding inside at the moment to get the roof propped, and I think it's probably just in time because it's moved even since I was there a couple of weeks ago. It's moving all the time and at risk of collapse. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the setting and the history of the church. I'm no expert on history, but I'll try and give a little bit of context. And then I'm going to talk much more about the building condition as I found it and our thinking on how to repair it. And then there's 2 particular aspects of the building I want to talk through in more detail. The obvious one is to do with the roof structure, which is the main problem with the building. But also I'd like to talk about the walls, because there are structural concerns with the walls, but also interesting issues to do with their presentation. internally and externally. So a really remarkable setting, actually, just sat here beside the river all on its own. We don't think that was the case historically. There are ruins along the river, or very small fragments of ruins there, which suggest that there was more of a community. But it sits very much alone. This is a view taken from the road, for those that don't know it. So it's got its own little track down to a churchyard, and it sits very gently there. This is a view from the opposite side. You can see the date, 1940, I think. So this gives much more of its traditional setting. The road, I imagine, was there previously in a smaller way than it is now. But this sort of quaint setting of the church beside the river is very much about the story of the building and its vernacular origins, I would say. So here's a plan just to give you a little bit of context so that you know your way around the building. A little bit later we'll zoom into a few areas, so it's useful just to have the geography, if you like. So the nave is the main part, and probably the earliest part, so likely 12th century. So the foundation here was a priory in 1183, I believe, Benedictine at that time, later Carthusian. So it's likely to have just been the nave, perhaps with an apse at this end. We're not quite sure what the detail was, but there's fabric missing from that period. And the chancel was added later, probably in the 15th century, and that's the time at which the whole of the nave and the chancel was re-roofed with the roof we believe we have there now. Later additions are the porch, and then the vestry much later again, as the vestry's, I think, 1889. So when we refer to different areas of the building, we tend to use the cardinal points, so north, south, east, and west. So the chancel is the east end with the altar at the east, and then the west end being where the bell is above. So again, for those that aren't really familiar with the building, we've got nave here with its porch and chancel and the bell turret. And this is a view from the other side, so this is from the field. So the east end's here on the left, this is the chancel, that's the nave there, the larger volume, with the bell turret, and then the little tiny vestry added on that side. Have most of you been to the building? Do you know it? You have. Well, many of you haven't been. Okay, that's interesting. So the interior is presented very much, the bones of it are ancient. The walls you see now you wouldn't have seen traditionally. They almost certainly would have been plastered and lime washed. But the ceiling is probably the most characterful part of the building and is what's so special about it, in my view. The fittings are mainly later. Well, they're all later, but some of them are older than other parts. The pews are actually quite late. They're part of the 1950s work with Ivor Bulmer-Thomas. But the pulpit and some of the desks are earlier. They're maybe 17th century, and the altar too. What else have we got? So this is a view from the east end looking west. So here we are. There's a desk here, reading desk, and the pulpit, which are 17th century, the much later pews. The font is one of the earliest parts, so we believe that's 12th century as well. And if it stayed in situ, it may be original to the building. And beyond that is this really interesting screen, which Ivor Bulmer-Thomas brought into the building in the 1950s. So it's not from here, but it is quite remarkable. We haven't got all the details on it, but it's certainly medieval, and it has painted figures on it, as you can see in these panels. Likely to have come from Devon. We don't know exactly where yet, but hopefully we'll find out more. Rachel's spoken already about the monument here to Ivor Bulmer-Thomas's wife, and there's also another much older monument here. I can't remember the date of that one. Can anybody see the date on there? It's 16 or 1700s, I think. But there aren't that many monuments in the church, certainly unlike the town churches, which tend to become very full of monuments over the centuries. So there we are, the pulpit on the right-hand side, quite simple, panelled structure. And on the left is St. James, who was also brought in by Ivor Bulmer-Thomas. I think it's foreign, I don't know the details, but probably 18th century with painted decoration. So quite an interesting thing. And here's the bell turret at the west end. And forgive me, I don't have the details of the age of the bell, but you can probably see the form of the bell is much longer than we recognize normally for church bells. And that's because it's pre-Reformation. It's a medieval bell. And I think this one's particularly early. I'm not sure if it's as early as the ones at Gwynnesney, but similar period. Okay, so the roof structure. So we've got this wagon roof here in the nave coming down to this point, and then another wagon roof in the chancel. And then usually there's this sloping section in between. And this was where the worst of the problems was revealed. So this beam was added probably in the 17th century, maybe 18th century. And presumably, we're guessing that was to do with tying the structure together. So we imagine there were problems even at that early time. But here you can see quite significant cracks on either side. And these were the real telltales that there was something going on. And on the outside, it was quite clear with the amount of movement here. This is just above the same place. You can see that the tiles have been lifting here. And what's actually happening is there's a huge dish in this part of the roof, and then it's rising up just over the gable. Well, not over the gable, over the supporting structure at the end there. So this is a plan of the roof structure. So again, nave and chancel, and you can see the trusses here. So you have principal trusses and then intermediate trusses of similar design, but this shows the bays of the ceiling pattern that you see from below. So we've got almost a complete medieval roof of the nave and the chancel in situ, we believe. There's a couple that are missing at the west end, and that's because some steels were put in there to support the bellcot. Possibly in the 50s. I'm not sure if that was part of the Ivor Bulmer-Thomas work. So I was just saying the worst of the problem is in this area, or the most evident problem is in this area. But actually we found out that almost every truss that we got to had failed structurally. So again, just pointing out to these two locations where the cracks in the plaster were found and are still getting worse. So I arrived in 2019, and I was given previous reports on the church where people had seen it for years and years and said, yes, these cracks are here, but it hasn't got any worse. But I was slightly nervous because I could see some old photos and I could see what it looked like now. And it was getting worse, without a doubt. And one of the telltales actually was the shape of the ceiling. So it should be a wagon ceiling. It should be a barrel, effectively. But if it's coming down in the middle, we know we've got quite a significant problem. And you can see that the panels, these are later plaster panels. The early ones were lost prior to 1950s. And so these are modern, quite lightweight plaster. But you can see they're deflecting in here. So there's quite a lot of movement going on. And they put brackets here to support the ends where they were no longer in contact with the wall. So here's a couple of sections to try and explain how the roof structure works a little bit. I'm no structural engineer, and I'm sorry our engineer isn't here tonight, but I'll try and talk through just some of the principles of what we think is going on. So unlike later trusses, you have trusses at very regular centres, as you'll have seen on the plan, and it's at the top there. So there aren't any purlins supporting the rafters. It's done, the trusses actually support the battens, which then hold the roof tiles. So it's a very simple structure in that sense. So each truss has a long principal on either side, and then a collar here. And these have some arch braces underneath to give a little bit of extra support, and those arch braces are actually part of the ceiling structure, which you see from beneath. But the problem we have is that the length from here to here is a very long distance. And what's happened is the stone tiles have been added for which we don't believe the roof was designed. So it's had a much heavier weight on it than we think it should have had. And so we've ended up with a lot of deflection happening in here. And I'll try and get to the next slide. Oh, there we are, that's easier. So the principal structure is a sort of A-frame. But what happens is these tend to bend because there's an additional weight on there. We think the church may originally have been thatched, and obviously a stone tile finish is going to be much, much heavier. When you consider that the stone tiles are lapped and they're an average of about 1.5 inches thick, you've got an average of of at least 3 inches of stone on the top there, across the whole of the roof, which is a huge weight. But as the principals bend, you tend to get outward movement pushing out, and that's very clear. What's happened is the wall plates have moved outwards, as Rachel mentioned earlier. So we've got inner wall plates here and outer wall plates, and everything's moving outwards. So the outer wall plate tends to move off the wall head, and certainly on this side, it actually moved to the point where it was barely even touching the wall. And the inner wall plates have rotated because they've been pushed. They're very large, actually, and beautiful and carved. And in fact, on one side, I think they're in a single piece the whole length of the nave, which is really quite remarkable. But relatively unusual, I think. I haven't come across it before. So these two wall plates are tied together, but what's happened is the outward pressure here and the rotation has actually caused pressure going both ways, so that the walls have actually cleaved. And if you think about the way a traditional wall's built, they tend to built with a solid face on one side and the other side, and then with relative sort of infill in between, although there are bonding stones and ties. You do tend to have this sort of splitting quite possible with that. And you can see it there. This is my approximation of the shape of the wall. But we'll come to some photos which show it better. But actually here on the right, you can see this is the wall plate that should have been sat right on the wall, but it's pushed out and it's actually taken quite a lot of this stonework with it. And seeing it today, it's a lot worse than that, actually. There we are. So we got up in 3 places inside when we investigated the structure. But unfortunately, we couldn't crawl through. I'd normally just crawl straight the way through and investigate, but it was far too dangerous to do that. We found that just about every single truss had not just minor problems, but really major problems with it. So many of them have broken on the principal, where the principal joins the collar, but also the collars have split in places as well. This is actually one of the 1950s repairs, which is to try and rehang the ceiling from that tie. I don't know if it's clear from the image, maybe from further away. But this is one of the molded arch braces, which is part of the ceiling structure. And that should be fully engaged with this timber, but it's dropped out. So they've hung it in position, but that's very little support. And it's not really giving the support to the roof structure that it needs. On this side, this is really to show some of the decay. So this is the full section of timber. And obviously when we get to here, there's nothing left at all at the junction. So the roof works entirely sort of codependently. It needs all the parts of the structure to be working together to make it work properly. And once these junctions break down, it becomes very difficult for it to carry the loads. Yeah, and I'm not quite sure what they were trying to do with these bits of string, but it may have helped. I mean, it looks like they put some sort of hook in from the top and they're trying to hang something. Or at least maybe they're trying to catch it if it does fall. I'm not sure. So there we are. Rachel mentioned these props that we put in, and I'm really glad we did. Now here's one of the structural engineer's drawings. So the challenge was to decide what to do with the roof, and what the engineer wanted to do and what we wanted to do was to take off the stone tiles and put a lighter finish on. That would have enabled us to do the minimum repairs to the timber structure, which is really the most valuable part of the craftsmanship of the building in our view. Unfortunately, after a couple of years of battling with the local authority, we realized we weren't going to get anywhere with trying to put a lighter finish on. So we had to accept that stone tiles were going to go back onto the roof. So we had then 2 further options. One is to put an independent steel structure within the configuration of oak work with the oak trusses, and to effectively hang the roof on a new structure, re-support it completely. But that's technically quite challenging. It's also bringing a lot of weight into the building. And because of the deflection of all the oak timbers, some of which have deflected one way and some of which have deflected the other, trying to design a new structure to go within that is a really complicated thing to do. And actually what we decided is we'd prefer to make the oak structure do the job that it was originally intended to still carry the loading of the roof, but to give it all the help it needs to do that. And unfortunately, in some ways, that's even more complicated than putting an independent structure in. But what it does mean, and I think this is fundamental from a kind of philosophical point of view, it means that the oak structure will be fundamentally doing its structural job. I think there's a risk if we leave it in a position where the oak is no longer required structurally. You put that at risk next time the churches are repaired. And if there's limited funds, who's going to look after the oak if it's not carrying the roof? It's just a thought for the future anyway. So we're trying to do the best we can in stitching it together. So the structural engineers devised a whole palette of different repairs. Some of them are traditional carpentry repairs because we want to repair the timberwork properly and traditionally, but then additional plates in stainless steel and stitching and anchoring. The main maybe slightly controversial thing is that we have to add ties running across here. And this is all to try and stop this deflection problem that we've been having for a very, very long time. They'll be very small, I think about 1 inch in diameter, and they'll be at intervals through the church. So we hope that their impact won't be too great. But we do feel that this is the best solution given the position we're in. But we will be repairing all of the ceilings, all of the trusses, and putting lath and lime plaster back in. So it will have its full traditional appearance, which will be really exciting. I want to talk a little bit about the walls as well. So this church was originally built with an earth mortar with some lime mixed into it, a hot lime mix as we would call it now. And the lime gives a little bit of strength to the earth, to the clay, but that's a really wonderfully soft and permeable mix. Then usually on the outside, and is the case here, there's a richer lime mix used for the weathering elements, so the pointing, and then probably a lime wash or a render. We'll come on to a little bit more detail now. But over the years, I'll stick on the traditional ones. So this is as close as we think is the most traditional finish to this building, which is a very rich clay mix with some lime inclusions in it. And that was used as a sort of flushing up, because what they were trying to do was to get the water off the building as quickly as they can. So they're trying to make a relatively flat surface. So you don't have stones that are catching water. And then it's lime, over the top there's a lime slurry or a sort of render coat, which is actually very thin, not like we would think of render now, being maybe 1 inch thick. It was a very, very thin skim, effectively, applied by hand, and then a lime wash finish, which gives additional protection. And then the lime wash would be reapplied, maybe every 3 or 4 years, to help keep the water out. What we have more recently on the left is maybe the most common sort of cement pointing we see, where it's taken relatively flush to the surface and just struck off. Unfortunately, the cement is impermeable, so it holds moisture within the walls. And this causes a lot of problems in various different ways. But one of the main ones is that traditional mortars were intended to be breathable and permeable so that any moisture that got into the walls would get out through the joints. So any decay that was caused by the moisture would happen in the mortar rather than in the stone. And because that's the sacrificial element, and you would then repair the mortar, which is a relatively straightforward process to do. What happens is when you apply cement in there is that the cement tends to be more impervious than the stone, and so moisture comes through the stone and it causes the stone to delaminate and to degrade much more quickly than it would otherwise. And this is what many of you will be very familiar with seeing, particularly in our towns. On the right, unfortunately very late cement pointing, and particularly hard, was applied maybe only 20 or 30 years ago. But I'm pleased to say Tom and his team have taken maybe half of that off already. So we'll be getting it back to its traditional character. A little bit on the windows as well. So that the window surrounds are all in sandstone, old red sandstone. And here you can see what happens to this sandstone when it's bedded in this way. So it's sedimentary stone, so it builds up in layers on the seabed. And as it's cut and put into the building, those layers can be in whatever orientation you choose. But where you've got very tall beds, you tend to have it laminating in this direction. And unfortunately, these just peel away, and it's very difficult to repair them. What we hope we can do is pack behind these with lime mortar and perhaps pin in places with very small stainless steel pins. And that's the sort of sensitive approach that we like to try and do. Unfortunately, previous repairs have been maybe less sympathetic. So you can see the one-in-one cement that's been applied over that one. And these wonderful mullions in the east window, so a medieval window. And unfortunately, the mullions have been caked in this cement, which hopefully Tom's going to chip off very, very carefully, and we'll see what's underneath. We really hope we can save what's there, though I have my doubts in places. I just want to talk a little bit about the interior and the presentation of the building, because we're used to seeing many of our churches with interiors a bit like this, with the stone exposed, and lots of people really like seeing the stone exposed and to see the pointing. But traditionally, that almost certainly wouldn't have been their appearance up until about the 19th century, when that became a sort of fashion, really. The walls would have been lime-washed, at least, if not plastered and lime-washed. And we intend to take out all this cement pointing all the way around and to present the church as it would have been in the medieval period. So it will be plastered and it will be lime-washed. I think one of the really important things that we'll do is to give a setting to the church which doesn't distract from the beautiful features from the medieval period and the fittings too. It will enable us to see the fittings against a much plainer background. It'll also mean that the walls can breathe properly and regulate humidity and moisture and so on, which is obviously fundamental to the long-term care of the building. So some structural cracks on the right. This has been happening largely, we think, as a result of the movement in the roof, despite the walls being up to 4 feet thick in places. There have been cracks occurring for a very long time, and the outward spread of the walls, because of the outward spread of the roof, has been quite significant. On the left is just some of the cement pointing. That's actually in the porch. This is in the chancel at the east end, where the walls were a bit thinner actually, but you can see a structural crack has been opened up and filled, and another here over decades. So we will be doing some structural anchoring through the walls from the outside in order to just stitch across those. Here we are. So here's just a little note of all the people that are involved. Perhaps not all of them, but most of us. So you know the Friends, you know Jones and Fraser are the main contractor. I'm helping with the architectural work and as a health and safety principal designer. We also have a quantity surveyor, a very good structural engineer, an ecologist, because we have bats in the building, and an archaeologist as well. And really excitingly, the Friends have commissioned the building's archaeologist to do what's called a level 3 record of the building. So that's a reading of the building from an archaeological perspective to try and understand everything we can read from it, but also a documentary research, finding as much information as we can possibly get and putting it together so that we get a really good picture of as much as we can possibly glean. And now's the time to do it while we're really exposing every part of the building through the works. Okay, thank you.